So I know you all don't know me very well, but I would like to ask a favor from you. Please close your eyes and place yourself back in a teenager's body. This might be easier for some than others. I'd also like for you to paint a visual in your head of a location that is relatively flat and barren and mainly prairie fields, really sunny and dry, very few trees, maybe some bison roaming around. This will be a location in the Midwest. It will be right beneath the Bible Belt, in the middle of the breadbasket of America, sort of in Tornado Alley. Please open your eyes. I hope that is somewhat similar to what is in your head right now. I'm gonna ask you to close your eyes again. And this time, assuming you're all North Carolina locals, paint an image of North Carolina as you know it, with the beautiful green trees and mountains and waterfalls and just vivid nature and life everywhere. Please open your eyes. I hope that is also somewhat representative of what's in your mind right now. So you have just lived the experience that I underwent as a freshman in high school when I moved across the states from Oklahoma to North Carolina. While the physical change was really beautiful and revitalizing, it was still sort of nerve-wracking in some senses because when I came to Chapel Hill, this was the first time that I understood where I stood financially, and compared to my peers, I was considered low income or poor. And this realization set in sort of urgent and modeled ways. I remember the first day of classes in high school being really stressful because my teachers expected me to be able to just buy the school supplies they wanted for me for their classes. Whereas in Oklahoma, this was not the case. It was pretty typical for a lot of students not to be able to afford school supplies every year, and they would just let you reuse old ones, or teachers would even provide them for you in the classrooms. I also remember being a student that received free lunch in schools and feeling embarrassed having to explain my situation to my peers. The case is, in Norman, Oklahoma, since it was a fairly racially homogenous place, if I felt out of place, I could usually place that on my skin color or my culture. But in Chapel Hill, it was very easy for me to not be the only person of color in a classroom. So then I found myself sort of outcast as an Asian American among my Asian American peers because I didn't afford the same luxuries as they did. I come from a single parent household, and that was sort of weird. I remember the experience that resonates with me most is probably driver's education. And what you do is you drive for 6 hours behind the wheel with an instructor and a fellow driving partner. And I remember being dropped off after my first session in front of my townhouse, which was sort of sheltered away by some trees. It was obviously pretty shabby and not the nicest house in the world, but where we could afford from when we moved from Norman, Oklahoma to here. And she turned around and she asked me, and I know her intentions were bad, but she asked me very curiously, she was like, "Is this really where you live?" And it made me feel really ashamed of where I came from. So from then on, I just asked my driver instructor to drop me off at the end of the street so I could walk home instead of being dropped off in front of my house. So I didn't feel very like I had a place at East Chapel Hill, so I looked for a way to get out of there. And so I applied to, was accepted to, and now attend NCSSM. And my experiences here have been, by and large, a lot better than my experiences at home. But those curiosities and the feelings of alienation still lingered over me. And what you do at a STEM school when you have questions is you do research. So through my mentorship program at school, I was able to find a field that had answers for the questions I was asking. And this field is called behavioral economics. And what it aims to explore is to understand how large-scale effects are influenced by small decisions and perceptions of people. I had the questions of, well, why does the wealth disparity exist? And do people really have like genuine understandings of it? So I found a professor in my field, and his name is Dan Ariely, and he was really renowned for his work in behavioral econ and the books he's published and the talks he's also given. And he encouraged me to pursue my interests in social justice and wealth inequality. So what you do in social science when you have a research question is you ask people on a large scale more questions and you analyze the results. What I did was I asked a lot of people to look at something like this, where the green bar represents 100% of America's wealth, and a white bar represents 20% of the world's population, America's population. And then I would ask people to envision in their heads what they thought the green bar looks like distributed across these 5/5 of the population, from the richest 20% to the poorest 20%. And I would also like to ask you to make a prediction as to what that looks like. Another thing I was curious about was what people want the wealth distribution to look like and whether or not that was different from what they thought it was. So I asked them also, what is your ideal wealth distribution across these 5 tiers? And I'm also going to ask you to think about what your ideal wealth distribution is. What does that green look like across these 5 tiers? These were the results. They're kind of small, but I'll explain them to you as best as I can. What we found was that people, on average, greatly underestimated how inequitable the wealth distribution is in the United States. But what was even more interesting was that there was equally as big a disparity between what people wanted the wealth distribution to be like versus what they perceived it to be. The top bar is what the actual wealth distribution is, and the middle bar is what people perceive the wealth distribution to be, and the lowest bar is what they want the wealth distribution to be. So you find that this suggests that there is some level of discontentment, although people are still misinformed about how drastic the disparity is, that people are still not satisfied with the way society is structured today. So the next question to ask is naturally, well, how do we achieve something that we want a little bit more? In the field of behavioral economics, one of the tenets is that making small shifts in the way you think and the way you perceive things will end up in bigger changes. So in the field of environmentalism, because we all know that's a big issue today, is preserving the environment. A group of social scientists went about asking the question, well, how do we get people to adhere to pro-environmental behaviors more often? And they hypothesized that, well, people care about their children and they care about the future, so if we ask them to think about the future a little bit and to think about their children, they'll be more willing to save the world. And this was true. And I hypothesized that this would also be applied to economics. So what I asked people to do to think about the future was, well, what do you want to be remembered for? I asked a group of people to list 5 items that they wanted their children to remember them for, whether they be gifts or qualities or traits. For example, I was a wonderful mother, I was really happy, I was a talented musician. And then we also had a control group. And what we found was that instilling within people a responsibility for the future, which is known as the future mindset condition, increased people's willingness to engage in activities that were aimed to reduce wealth inequality. In groups of people who thought about the future, they were more willing to donate nearly twice as much of their income to an organization whose goal was to reduce wealth inequality. And those people were also more willing to volunteer nearly a whole hour more for the same organization. So basically what I learned from this was that if you take the time out of your day to think about what is to come, because I know we live in an era where things are really rushed and every day feels really urgent and stressful, and I know my goal is to just see what comes for the next 24 hours, but it's equally as important to think about what comes in the next days and weeks and months and years, because those small changes, if you remember them before you make your decisions, could really shift society to a better place. What I want to leave you with is this quote from Vincent van Gogh. Great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. What kind of change do you see happening if you just took small times out of your day to think about the future a little bit more before you make decisions? What if one day we could live in a society where students didn't have to feel ashamed of where they lived, or even worry about having to have a house? What if they didn't have to feel ashamed of what they ate for lunch, or worry about having food at all? What if one day these worries weren't part of our reality anymore? Thank you for listening to me speak.